The cameras were rolling, the audience was cheering, and then 21-year-old Marcus Johnson stood at the Family Feud podium, wearing a perfectly pressed button-down shirt that concealed the scars from shrapnel wounds he'd received in Iraq, his posture military straight but his eyes holding shadows that spoke of battles that continued long after the official war had ended. When Steve Harvey asked about wars nobody knows you're fighting, Marcus's response, delivered with the hollow precision of someone who had learned to compartmentalize trauma but could no longer contain the truth, would reveal that the most dangerous combat zone he faced wasn't in the desert overseas, but in the quiet moments of everyday life, where memories became weapons and peace felt like a lie. "The war I fight at home," Marcus had said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of 18 months of pretending to be fine while his mind replayed horrors that his family couldn't see, couldn't understand, and couldn't heal. "It's harder than the war I fought overseas because over there you knew who the enemy was." The studio had fallen into the kind of profound silence that comes when people realize they're witnessing something that transcends entertainment and enters the sacred territory of a warrior's honest confession about battles that rage in places no armor can protect. Marcus Johnson had enlisted in the Army at 18, 3 weeks after high school graduation, driven by a combination of patriotic duty, family tradition, and the need to prove himself as a man worthy of the Johnson legacy of military service. His grandfather had served in Vietnam, his father had been deployed during the Gulf War, and Marcus had grown up believing that military service was not just an honor but a rite of passage that would transform him from a boy into the kind of man his family could be proud of. The deployment to Iraq had lasted 15 months, during which Marcus had served as an infantry soldier in one of the most dangerous regions of the country. He had experienced combat situations that had tested every aspect of his training, his courage, and his understanding of what it meant to survive when survival required making split-second decisions that carried life-and-death consequences for himself and his fellow soldiers. Marcus had witnessed things that no 20-year-old should ever have to see. Friends killed by improvised explosive devices, civilians caught in crossfire, the aftermath of suicide bombings that had left him questioning his faith in human nature and his understanding of what constituted justice in a world where violence seemed to be the only language anyone understood. He had killed enemy combatants in firefights that had lasted seconds, but had replayed in his memory for months, leaving him with a complex mixture of pride in defending his fellow soldiers and guilt over taking lives that had belonged to people who might have been fathers, sons, or brothers themselves. But the incident that had fundamentally changed Marcus had occurred during his final month of deployment, when his convoy had been attacked by insurgents using rocket-propelled grenades and automatic weapons. Marcus had survived with relatively minor injuries, shrapnel wounds that had required surgery but had healed within weeks, but 3 of his closest friends had been killed in the attack, including his best friend Carlos Martinez, who had been sitting less than 5 feet away when the explosion had torn through their vehicle. The randomness of survival had haunted Marcus in ways that his family couldn't understand. He had been spared not through any heroic action or superior skill, but through pure chance, the accident of positioning that had placed him on one side of the vehicle rather than the other. Carlos had died while Marcus had lived, and no amount of rational explanation could convince Marcus that he deserved to survive when his friend, who had been funnier, kinder, and more loved by everyone in their unit, had not. The return home had been celebrated by Marcus's family as a triumphant conclusion to his service, but for Marcus it had felt like the beginning of a different kind of warfare. His parents, Robert and Linda Johnson, had organized a welcome home party, had proudly displayed his medals and service ribbons, and had expected him to transition smoothly back into civilian life with the confidence and maturity that military service was supposed to provide. But Marcus had discovered that the skills that had kept him alive in Iraq, hypervigilance, aggressive responses to perceived threats, emotional numbing that allowed him to function under extreme stress, were not only unnecessary in civilian life, but actively destructive to his ability to maintain relationships, hold employment, or experience the kind of peace and normalcy that his family assumed he would want after his ordeal overseas. The symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder had begun almost immediately upon his return, but had been subtle enough that Marcus and his family had initially attributed them to normal readjustment difficulties. Marcus had trouble sleeping, experienced anxiety in crowded places, and had difficulty concentrating on tasks that had seemed important before his deployment but now felt trivial compared to the life-and-death decisions he had been making for over a year. But as months passed, the symptoms had intensified rather than improved. Marcus had begun experiencing nightmares that left him sweating and disoriented, flashbacks that transported him back to combat situations without warning, and panic attacks that made him feel like he was dying, even though he was sitting safely in his childhood bedroom. He had started avoiding social situations because unexpected noises made him jump, had stopped driving because traffic reminded him of convoy operations, and had isolated himself from friends and family members who couldn't understand why he seemed angry, distant, and fundamentally changed. The most painful aspect of Marcus's struggle had been his family's inability to understand that his war hadn't ended when he returned home. They had celebrated his safe return, had expected him to be grateful for his survival, and had become frustrated and confused when he seemed unable to appreciate the peace and security that his service had helped protect. They had interpreted his withdrawal and emotional numbness as ingratitude, his hypervigilance as paranoia, and his difficulty adjusting as a lack of motivation rather than symptoms of a medical condition that required treatment. Marcus had tried desperately to meet his family's expectations, to be the hero they believed him to be, to transform his war experience into the kind of character-building narrative that would make his service meaningful and his sacrifice worthwhile. He had applied for college, had attempted to maintain relationships, and had tried to participate in family gatherings and social events with the enthusiasm and engagement that everyone expected from a young veteran who should have been proud of his service and eager to build on his military experience. But the disconnect between his internal reality and the expectations of his family and community had created an additional layer of suffering on top of his already overwhelming symptoms. Marcus had felt like he was failing not only to recover from his trauma, but to live up to the heroic image that others had projected onto his military service. He had begun to believe that his inability to adjust proved that he was weak, ungrateful, or fundamentally flawed in ways that his fellow veterans who seemed to transition more successfully somehow were not. The application to Family Feud had been submitted by Linda Johnson, who had thought that appearing on television as a family might help Marcus reconnect with the sense of pride and accomplishment that military service was supposed to provide. She had hoped that celebrating his service in a public forum might help him understand how much his family and community appreciated his sacrifice, and might motivate him to seek the counseling that she had begun to suspect he needed, but had been reluctant to pursue. During the pre-show preparations, Marcus had been quiet and withdrawn, participating in the required activities but clearly struggling with the noise, crowds, and unpredictable nature of television production. The production team had been impressed by his military bearing and obvious intelligence, but they had also noticed that he seemed hyper-aware of his surroundings, positioned himself with clear sightlines to exits, and appeared to be monitoring potential threats that others couldn't identify. The game had been proceeding with Marcus participating minimally, giving brief, precise answers when his turn came but otherwise remaining as inconspicuous as possible while his family engaged enthusiastically with Steve Harvey and the competitive aspects of the show. The Johnson family was competing against the Martinez family from California, and while both sides had been playing with appropriate energy, there was something restrained about Marcus's participation that suggested he was more focused on managing his internal state than on enjoying the experience. But when it came time for the category Wars Nobody Knows You're Fighting, and it was Marcus's turn at the buzzer, the question had struck directly at the heart of his daily struggle and the invisible battle that defined every moment of his existence since returning from Iraq. Steve Harvey had approached the podium with his usual warm energy, but something about Marcus's military posture and the intensity in his eyes had made Steve more attentive and respectful than usual. "All right, Marcus," Steve had said with obvious respect for his veteran status. "Wars nobody knows you're fighting. What comes to mind?" Marcus had looked at Steve with eyes that held depths of experience that seemed impossible for someone so young, then at his family, who were watching with love and pride, then back at Steve with the kind of honesty that comes from someone who has faced death and understands that some truths are too important to hide behind politeness. "The war I fight at home," Marcus had said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak about warfare. "It's harder than the war I fought overseas because over there, you knew who the enemy was." Steve had paused, immediately recognizing that this young man was sharing something profound and that the studio was witnessing a veteran's honest testimony about the hidden costs of military service. "Can you help me understand what that war looks like?" Steve had asked with genuine respect and curiosity. Marcus had taken a breath, seeming to make a decision to trust this moment and this audience with his truth. "I've been home for 8 months," Marcus had said, "but my mind is still over there. I have nightmares every night about my friends who didn't make it back. I can't go to crowded places without scanning for threats. I hear fireworks, and I hit the ground because my body thinks it's incoming mortars." The studio audience had become completely attentive, understanding that they were hearing something important and real from someone who had sacrificed more than they had ever imagined. "My family thinks I should be grateful to be home safe," Marcus had continued, "and I am grateful. But I'm also carrying the weight of survival when better men than me didn't survive. I'm fighting a war against my own mind every day, and I'm losing." Steve had moved closer to Marcus, his expression showing deep respect and understanding. "Marcus," Steve had said, "what you're describing is called post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's not a sign of weakness. It's a normal response to abnormal experiences. You're not losing the war, you're fighting a battle that requires different weapons than the ones you used overseas." Steve had turned to address Marcus's family, who were listening with obvious shock and concern. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," Steve had said, "your son just told you something that took incredible courage to share. He's been fighting 2 wars, one for his country and one for his mental health. Both of them require your support." Robert Johnson had stepped forward from the family podium, his face showing pain and regret. "Son," Robert had said, "why didn't you tell us how bad it was? We thought you were just having trouble adjusting." "Because I thought I should be stronger," Marcus had replied, "because I thought admitting I was struggling meant I was dishonoring the guys who didn't make it home." Steve had looked at Marcus with the kind of understanding that comes from someone who has dealt with men who have faced impossible situations. "Marcus," Steve had said, "honoring your fallen brothers doesn't mean destroying yourself. It means getting the help you need so you can live the life they can't live, so you can be the man they would want you to be." Steve had begun removing his suit jacket, but this gesture was different from his other symbolic moments. This was about recognizing a warrior's service and sacrifice. "Marcus," Steve had said, placing the jacket around his shoulders, "this jacket represents something very important today. It represents understanding that the war you're fighting now is just as real, just as important, and just as deserving of support as the war you fought overseas." Marcus had pulled the jacket closer, the weight and warmth providing some comfort amid the overwhelming relief of finally being honest about his struggle. Steve had turned to address the studio audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve had announced, "Marcus Johnson served our country with honor and courage. Now he's fighting a different battle, and he deserves our support, our understanding, and our commitment to making sure no veteran fights alone." The game had been suspended as Marcus was connected with veteran support services and mental health professionals who specialized in treating combat-related PTSD. Steve had remained with Marcus throughout the initial consultations, providing continuity and support during what was clearly a crucial intervention. The episode aired 4 months later and became a powerful advocacy tool for veteran mental health awareness. Veterans organizations used Marcus's story to encourage other struggling veterans to seek help and to educate families about the signs and symptoms of combat-related trauma. Marcus had kept Steve's jacket as a symbol of the moment when his invisible war became visible and met with understanding rather than judgment. More importantly, he had begun receiving treatment that acknowledged both his service to his country and his need for support in dealing with the psychological wounds that warfare inevitably inflicts. The jacket represented his understanding that seeking help for PTSD wasn't weakness, but another form of courage, that the battles he fought at home were just as significant as the battles he had fought overseas, and that true strength sometimes meant admitting that even warriors need support to heal from the wounds that don't show on the outside. Because that's what courage looks like when it faces its own vulnerability and asks for help. That's what honor sounds like when it admits that service comes with costs that extend far beyond the battlefield. And that's what happens when a 21-year-old veteran learns that the war he fights at home is just as real as the war he fought overseas, and that victory in both battles requires not just strength but wisdom, support, and the understanding that healing is not surrender but the foundation for the kind of life that makes sacrifice meaningful. Marcus Johnson had been fighting 2 wars, one for his country and one for his sanity, but on that day at Family Feud, he discovered that he didn't have to fight alone, that his invisible battles were worthy of the same honor and support as his visible service, and that sometimes the greatest victory is simply having the courage to admit that even heroes need help to heal.